So today we'll be tackling not one, not two, but 3 mosaic projects. And I'll also be incorporating mosaic mesh on one of the projects, and we'll talk about why you would want to use mesh on a project like this. I know it seems a little strange, including the pros and cons of doing that, but we'll get to that later in the video. Now, when I do videos like this, I'm often asked, how does my ruler not slip or move around, especially when cutting such thin strips? Now let's talk a minute about adhesives for glass-on-glass mosaics and how to avoid grout bleed. Our last project is a mesh mosaic short vase, and you may be sitting there wondering, why on earth would I use mosaic mesh on a clear glass project? As you can see, all of my tesserae are pretty much of the same thickness, unlike the last vase we just tiled. So you better buckle up because we've got a lot going on. Let's get to it. Welcome back, and if you're new here, my name is Julie, and on this channel we talk about tips, tricks, tools, adhesives, materials, and specific mosaic projects, all to shorten your learning curve when it comes to creating mosaic art. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please consider subscribing. We've got so much fun stuff planned in this video today. So if you love glass-on-glass mosaics, or you're wondering how can you incorporate mesh into a glass mosaic project, or if you thought there's no way that you can incorporate mesh into a glass mosaic project. Oh, and we'll also be making a mixed media mosaic on a glass substrate. So you better buckle up because we've got a lot going on. I love a mosaic on glass project, and I know some people might be a little leery about using glass as a substrate. It's been my experience of using glass as a substrate that if you respect it, it will respect you. So no, it's not as solid as, let's say, doing a mosaic on cement or wood or some other solid surface, but still, it makes for a great substrate, and the results, depending on the tesserae that you use, could be a stunning mosaic project. The glass substrates I'll be using in today's video were made in 2 previous videos here on my channel. The first video was the one where I demonstrated how to cut down glass bottles, and if you watched, you may recall I had over 40 liquor bottles, and no, they were not mine. Plus I had some other things like Starbucks Frappuccino bottles and Kavita probiotics drinks. Those bottles were mine. And I showed you how to score and cut the bottles to use for mosaic projects or whatever you wanted. And then the second video, which helped me prep today's glass substrates, was the video where I showed you how to polish rough glass to a shiny finish. I found it to be a really fun process, and it's weird because by the end I felt so much more relaxed. I don't know why, but I was thankful for it. So I'll link both of those videos down below in the description so you can check them out and see how we got to this point that we're at today. You can access this information by clicking more under the video description. That's if you're watching on your desktop computer. And if you're watching on your tablet or your smartphone, you can click more to the right of the video title. So today we'll be tackling not one, not two, but 3 mosaic projects. So we'll be making a votive, as well as a bud vase, and a small bouquet vase. As I mentioned earlier, 2 of the projects are a glass-on-glass mosaic, and one of them is a mixed media on glass project. And I'll also be incorporating mosaic mesh on one of the projects, and we'll talk about why you would want to use mesh on a project like this. I know it seems a little strange, including the pros and cons of doing that, but we'll get to that later in the video. We'll also talk about the adhesives and the tesserae that I use for each project. And yes, these mosaics will be grouted. So in today's video, we'll mosaic 3 glass substrates, each with their own aesthetic and tesserae selection, plus we'll grout and finish them off. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. For our first mosaic project, we're going to make a votive, and lately I have been obsessed with the color combination of navy blue, peach, and tan, or like tan, cream, beige, somewhere in that earthy family. So that's what I'm going to incorporate in this first project. So I pulled together a few pieces of stained glass which I thought looked good together. Now, as you can see, the navy blue stained glass is transparent, whereas the peach and tan glass are semi-transparent. So for this votive, I want to cut the stained glass in long, thin strips to start off with. So I got out my waffle cutting grid and my pistol grip glass cutter and got to work. Now, I'm not measuring how wide I'm cutting the glass strips. I'm just eyeing it. So if you aren't sure how to score and cut stained glass, I've done a video here on my channel which will guide you step by step through the process, including what tools you'll need and all of that good stuff. So I'll include a link to that video down below in the description. Now, the navy blue glass will be my predominant color in this mosaic, so I need to cut the most of that color. And once I was done scoring all of the navy blue strips, I used my running pliers to break the glass apart. And then next, I moved on to the peach glass and I scored it the same exact way as I did the navy blue stained glass. Same width, same process. I scored a couple and then held it up to the navy blue strips just to make sure I was in the ballpark as far as the width was concerned. Now, when I do videos like this, I'm often asked, how does my ruler not slip or move around, especially when cutting such thin strips? And it's because the ruler has a non-skid backing, and I absolutely love it. And I'll include a link to it down below in the description with the other materials, tools, waffle grid, etc. that I'm using in today's video. So as long as I apply a little bit of pressure to the ruler, it doesn't move. In the same way that I would apply a little bit of pressure when holding a ruler in place and running a ballpoint pin along the side of it. And once I was done scoring and breaking apart the peach stained glass, I moved on to the tan glass. And I scored it the same way as the navy and the peach glasses, same width as well. And after I broke apart a few strips, I held them up to the navy and the peach glass, just to double check that all three colors were basically the same width. So here's the glass substrate we'll be working with on this project. It'll make a good sized votive, and I should mention that I'm planning to put a battery operated votive in this mosaic once it's all done. As you can see, there's a chip in the glass up at the rim, which happened during the process when I was breaking the bottle. It's not going to impact the mosaic work that I have planned for it. I'll cover it with stained glass and it won't make a difference or be visually obvious. As a reminder, I've already polished the rim to a shiny finish in that previous video that I mentioned. There are some nicks in the rim and I polished them as well as I could. Now, if this was intended to be a drinking glass, I wouldn't use it as a substrate. I would choose another bottle that broke more clean and that I could polish up perfectly. But for a votive, I'm not looking for perfection, and this substrate is more than acceptable for a votive. Next up, let's talk about the adhesive for this project. And this is for those of you who have asked me, why don't I ever use E6000 as an adhesive when I need a clear adhesive, whether it's glass on glass or whatever? This video is for you because E6000 is all over the place. For the adhesive, you guessed it, I'll be using E6000, which is a great adhesive for glass on glass mosaic, especially if you'll be using transparent or semi-transparent stained glass or tesserae. Now we're ready to get started with the tiling, and although the design for this votive is simple and pretty straightforward, I did give myself one rule. I wanted at least one horizontal grout line to appear in each vertical strip or line that's adhered to the substrate. And although at this point I had no idea what grout color I was going to use, I knew at least I wanted the grout to play a part in each vertical line to break things up aesthetically. And that I was leaning towards a light grout color to bring in some contrast. I used my wheeled glass nippers to break the strips of stained glass into smaller pieces. Now let's talk a minute about adhesives for glass-on-glass mosaics and how to avoid grout bleed. So grout bleed is when grout gets between your glass substrate and your glass tesserae. And you're only worried about grout bleed if you're using transparent or semi-transparent glass. You're able to view the grout through your tesserae when looking at it from the front. We don't want this. I avoid that happening by buttering the adhesive onto the back of every single tesserae. I know you're rolling your eyes at this point, but just hear me out here. I don't want to put a little adhesive on and then press it down until it touches the substrate surface. I'm not going to take that risk in hoping the adhesive spreads itself evenly. Instead, I make sure adhesive is on every area of the backside of the tesserae. Now, as you can imagine, an adhesive like E6000 doesn't exactly grab tesserae the way some other mosaic adhesives would. So what I like to do is shimmy the tesserae up against the substrate to create a little friction. Now, I'm not saying this is going to totally prevent your tesserae from sliding, but it will definitely help, especially if you use smaller sizes and lighter weight tesserae. And so I continued tiling one row after the other, and I randomly placed peach or tan tesserae in amongst the navy blue stained glass. And as you can see, to keep the votive from rolling, I rested it in between the handles of my tile nippers, which did the trick. This is a great project if you want to mosaic something, but you don't have to do much thinking. I know that sounds kind of bad, but I found myself being able to let my mind wander, knowing that I'm not going to mess anything up. And as I got further along with the tiling, I was able to turn the votive over on its side, which I had just tiled. I was being gentle and not handling it too much, but yes, the adhesive kept tesserae in place even with the weight of the substrate on it. This was a quick project to tile, as are all three of the projects in today's video. So the last thing I did to the votive before I let it sit and dry before grouting was I needed to address the bottom of the substrate. So you know how on the bottom of most bottles, it's not a straight 90-degree angle where the side meets the bottom? So the way I tiled the bottom of the bottle was that the stained glass strips actually, they go a little longer than the side of the bottle, if that makes sense. So what this does is it creates a gap which could be filled with grout. And we don't want that, right? Because then we were just talking about eliminating grout bleed. This would in essence create grout bleed like on purpose, and we don't want that. So how we get around that is I filled it in with E6000 so that grout wouldn't be able to get in there behind the stained glass. And then once I was done, I let it sit and dry for 48 hours before moving on to the grouting. Let's move on to the next mosaic, which is a mixed media bud vase. I wanted the colors to be natural earthy tones, so colors like cream and caramel, tan, and metallic gold. I pulled tesserae like vitreous glass tile in the 3/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch sizes, plus smalty, metallic gold glass tile, and metallic gold ceramic tile. So here's the glass bottle I broke down in that previous video, and I think it looks like a bud vase because it's tall and narrow. I certainly wouldn't put a bouquet in it. And I like how the bottom of the bottle has some cool detail, which I definitely don't want to cover up. And of course, I've already polished the rim to a shiny finish, which I did in that previous video. Next, I got to work cutting down the tesserae into smaller sizes with my wheeled glass nippers. I kept things simple and nipped the tile down into squares and rectangles of different sizes. Now, take note that I did not cut down the 3/8 of an inch square vitreous tile. I left them as is, and the same goes for the metallic gold glass tile and the metallic gold ceramic tile. So all three of those were kept intact. So I held the tessera against the substrate to get an idea of how far down visually from the rim I wanted to start the mosaic tile work. And once I had an idea, I got to work. Now I'm not going to tile the entire surface area of the bottle because, as I mentioned a moment ago, I really like that detail at the bottom of the bottle, and I want to be able to see that once the mosaic is complete. This time it doesn't matter if I get grout behind the tesserae because the tesserae isn't transparent or semi-transparent. So I'm applying enough adhesive but not worrying about covering the entire back of the tesserae. The design for this bud vase is a strip or band around the bottle in a color block pattern, and it's up towards the top, closer to the rim. And the rule I set for myself is that no two colors which are alike can be next to each other. It's silly, but I've got so many colors to play with, I thought, you know what? Two colors that are alike don't need to be next to each other because, you know, I got rules. As you can see, the surface level of the tesserae is not even. Some tesserae are thicker than others, and I'm okay with that. That's pretty standard when it comes to a mixed media mosaic, unless you really put forth effort to get all of your tesserae to the same thickness. I like it, and I think it adds character to the piece. It's definitely unusual for a vase. Again, just like in the previous mosaic, as I place a tessera on the substrate, I'm giving it a little shimmy to create friction, which will help the adhesive hold the piece in place while it dries. If you're using a round substrate, you'll want to rest it safely and gently between something to keep it rolling. And as you can see, just like with the previous project we worked on, I'm keeping the vase between the handles of my tile nippers. As I mentioned earlier, this is a quick project for you to mosaic, whether you're making one or let's say you have an event or a special dinner or something and you'd like one at every table. It goes very quickly if you keep the design simple and small. So once I was done, I waited about 10 minutes and then used a straight edge razor blade to clean up the adhesive that oozed out from under the tesserae. Now keep in mind, glass can get scratched, especially when you've got a razor blade going. So you want to be careful with this step, not just for the sake of the glass, but also you don't want to get cut. Things are slippery on these curved surfaces. So I took the razor blade and got under the exposed adhesive and scraped it towards the tesserae. Sometimes the adhesive would come off and sometimes it just wanted to stay on the substrate. And that was fine because I would just scrape it up against the tesserae, which would be an additional adhesive for keeping it against the substrate. If your adhesive gets smeared onto the glass substrate, go back and forth over it gently with the razor blade and you'll eventually get it off and the glass will be totally clear again. And then I let the mosaic sit and fully dry for at least 48 hours before moving on to the grouting. I'll include a list down below in the description for everything that I used in today's video, the tools, the tesserae, the adhesives, in case you'd like to make some glass-on-glass mosaics of your own. Our last project is a mesh mosaic short vase, and you may be sitting there wondering, why on earth would I use mosaic mesh on a clear glass project? And you know what I say? There are a few reasons why you might want to do this. But first, if you aren't familiar with mosaic mesh, it's a flexible mesh made of fiberglass and can be used as a substrate, meaning you can tile on it as a temporary substrate to then later be installed onto its permanent substrate. So this particular mesh is sticky on one side, meaning it's covered with an adhesive on one side. It's also available with no adhesive. I've done a video here on my channel all about how to use mosaic mesh in your artwork, and I will include a link to that video down below in the description so you can check it out. So in the case of this video, I want to show you another tiling alternative compared to the previous project that we just did. I know tiling on a curved surface sometimes doesn't interest or jazz certain mosaic artists. And then you've got the glass element, you've got the adhesive element. Things can get slippery, slidey, and it gets to be a very challenging, frustrating project, and I don't want to see you abandon it. So bringing in the mesh element, you'll see, will make things much easier. There are, however, some cons to doing this, which we're going to go over later in the video. To get started, I'm going to measure all the way around the outside of the cut glass bottle. And just like with the previous vase, I'm also going to do a strip of mosaic all the way around, leaving most of the glass substrate untiled. So with scissors, I cut down the mesh, and then I further cut down the mesh more to a smaller, narrower strip. And then I fit it again around the outside of the glass substrate and made a small adjustment to the length. So the design for this glass will be green color block. So I got to work picking out 3/4 inch vitreous glass tile and other types of glass tile in a number of shades. I also wanted to include a couple iridescent shades because I am into iridescence right now. I don't know if it's the summer. I don't know, but I had to include some iridescence in this, okay? I don't know. I'll be working on a sheet of wax paper for this mosaic, and I like using wax paper when working with particular mosaic adhesives because they won't stick to it, and you'll see what I mean a little later in the video. Now, contrary to what you may be thinking that I'm going to do here, I'm actually going to put the sticky side of the mesh facing down onto the wax paper. I'm not going to use the adhesive of the mosaic mesh for my tesserae, but instead, the adhesive on the back will help me when I'm at the point of adhering the mosaic mesh to the glass substrate. So before I started tiling, I cut the tesserae with my wheeled glass nippers into rectangles and square shapes of different sizes. Oh, and here they are. I love all these green shades so much, plus those 2 iridescent shades. This gets me so excited. So to glue my tesserae onto the mesh, I'm going to use Weld Bond. Now this is a white glue which dries clear. And as I get started with the tiling, take note that I'm not fully buttering the back of the tesserae. I'm just dabbing it on a few spots just to anchor it to the mesh. So we're not slathering it on the back like we did with the previous vase and the previous adhesive, that E6000. But why are we adhering the adhesive differently with this one? And that is because we're going to be using another adhesive to adhere this mosaic on mesh strip to the final substrate. And we want that adhesive to not only grab a hold of the mesh, but we also want it to come through the mesh and grab a hold of the actual tesserae as well. And just like with the previous mosaic vase, this one is also quick to tile. I've got a nice mix of shades, so I'll be able to place tesserae and avoid putting 2 of the same color next to each other because, as we know, I've got rules for myself. As you can see, all of my tesserae are pretty much of the same thickness, unlike the last vase we just tiled. So let's get back to Weld Bond for a minute. Weld Bond is a self-leveling adhesive, meaning it's going to keep spreading, as opposed to an adhesive like Thin Set or Epoxy Sculpt, which basically stays in place where you put it. So as I'm nearing the end of tiling the strip, I'm not going to mosaic all the way to the end of the mesh. I'd much rather add a couple tesserae if needed at the end after it's been adhered to the final substrate. So for now, the mosaic on mesh will sit here on the wax paper and dry thoroughly for 24 to 48 hours before I come back and adhere this strip to the glass substrate. And also at this point, I leave my glass tesserae out on that white project tray. I leave it out because I know, as we just discussed, once I pull that strip around onto the substrate, there's going to be a little bit of a gap and I'm going to need to fill it with something. So I'm just going to leave my tesserae out. So at this point in the project, you do not want to put your tesserae away. Leave it out, put it to the side because you may need it. Okay, it's been a couple days and I'm ready to adhere this mosaic on mesh to the glass substrate. Now I'll carefully and slowly pull it off of the wax paper. Now I'm not pulling the strip up. I'm trying to keep it as straight as possible and not make sudden movements. Something you could do is actually pull the paper, hold the strip up and pull the paper away from the bottom of the mosaic strip. Now, I don't know why, but I find this to be incredibly satisfying. It's so silly, but I love pulling mosaic on mesh pieces off of the wax paper. It's very tactile. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a sense of accomplishment, but I love it. I love it. And now the strip is free of the wax paper and I can do so many things with this mosaic on mesh. But I'm going to be very careful with it because remember, we only anchored down the tesserae just enough to keep them in place on the mesh. And now we're ready to adhere it to its final glass substrate. And yes, we'll be using E6000 as the adhesive to do that. So I put E6000 on the back of the mosaic mesh. Now if I didn't cover the back of every single part of the mesh, then the self-adhesive film on the mesh will also help that E6000 keep things in place while the adhesive dries. So they're working together. Do you see what I mean? The adhesive of the mesh and the E6000 adhesive, they are working together in case I didn't fully cover the back of all of that mesh mosaic. So to adhere the mesh mosaic, I'm just slowly rolling the glass substrate as I place the strip. So take your time with this process. I should also mention here that if you want to use some other clear adhesive on any of these projects, that's fine as well. So you've seen me use Lexil and Clear Liquid Nails, and Loctite and GE have clear adhesives. Just make sure if you're making a vase or a drinking glass or something that will come in contact with liquids, make sure that you use a waterproof, water-resistant adhesive. So for example, Weld Bond, it's not a waterproof adhesive, although it does dry clear. But we were only using it to keep tesserae in place. It's actually the E6000 which will permanently hold everything together onto the glass substrates. So you can use Weld Bond on your substrate, but make sure whatever that end result adhesive is, where you adhere your strip, your mosaic on mesh strip to your substrate, make sure that that is a good waterproof, water-resistant adhesive. Another thing, I'm not so worried because yes, I'm using the E6000, but also the type of grout I'll be using will add another level of protection for the mosaic work. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. And once the mesh was fully adhered, I see that there's a gap in the tesserae where the two ends meet, which we talked about a little earlier that it might possibly happen. So I'll find a couple tesserae and adhere them to the substrate. And just like I did on the previous vase, I used a straight edge razor blade to clean off any of the adhesive that oozed out from the sides of the mesh mosaic, or where maybe it had gotten on my hands and then I touched other areas of the substrate. It comes off easily. Just take that razor blade, rub it gently over the area, and you'll see how the adhesive will just come off of the substrate. And now I'll let the vase sit and dry for at least 48 hours before moving on to the grouting step. I mentioned a little earlier that there are some drawbacks to using mesh on your glass mosaic projects. Now, as you can see on the green vase, if you're looking at the substrate from above, even slightly above, you can see inside the vase and see the mesh from the back. That may not bother you at all, or it may bother you greatly and deter you from using it altogether. Personally, it doesn't bother me because I plan to use this vase as a mini bouquet vase and not a single flower or bud vase. So no one will actually be able to see inside the vase and notice the mesh because I will arrange my flowers appropriately with, letting some leaves hang down and, big blooms and whatever, but I will hide that. Another downside to using mesh would be if you were using transparent or semi-transparent glass. You would be able to see the mesh through the front of the glass, and that would be a real distraction for your mosaic work. Another con or drawback would or could be this right here, depending on if you like this look or not. But when you tile your mosaic on mesh and you're working on your horizontal surface, everything looks great. And you like how your tesserae are spaced evenly or whatever, but you are intentional with where you are placing your tesserae on that mesh. But when you adhere the mesh mosaic to its final curved substrate, all of a sudden your grout lines open up, which could be a little or a lot depending on the size of your substrate. Think about it in this way. The smaller your substrate, the more your grout lines will open up, and the bigger the substrate, the less your grout lines will open up. So it's a matter of personal preference. There's no right or wrong way. Okay, all three mosaics have been sitting here for at least 48 hours. And as each of these mosaics were drying, I did check them periodically, which I usually do when working on a vertical surface, especially when glass is the substrate and I'm using a clear adhesive. That combination loves to dance, so to speak. They don't stay still. Plus you throw in a little gravity. So I am always there to break up the party and make sure everything stays in place where I left it. And if you're using heavier tesserae, you can certainly adhere some of the blue painter's tape to the tesserae surface and the substrate to keep everything in place while the adhesive fully dries. So 2 of the 3 mosaics will have the same color of grout. However, I'm not actually using grout, but rather I'm using thinset. I started by grouting the 2 mosaics, which will share the same color, and I began with some white thinset and added a little colorant to it. And if you'd like to learn how to color or tint your grout or thinset, I've done a video here on my channel, and I'll include a link to it down below in the description so you can check it out. And I should also mention that if you've never mixed up thinset or grout, I have done videos on these topics, and I will also include links to those videos down below in the description. I want to slightly dull down the stark white of the thinset and give it a little warmth. So I added a little brown oxide and stirred it up thoroughly, and then added my water and mixed it up really well. So while the thinset is sitting here for a few minutes, I'll tape up the bud vase. So I'm using blue painter's tape to give me a straight grout line. Now I'm not taping it up because the grout is going to scratch anything. It's just for a straight grout line, and you do not have to do this. It's just something that I like to do. If you're nervous that your substrate may get slippery once you get started with the grouting, you can also tape up the entire substrate, which won't be grouted, and that'll give you some leverage. And then I got to work grouting the vase by going in clockwise, counterclockwise motions, pushing the grout into the areas between the tesserae. Now I'm definitely being careful and taking my time on this one because I'm working with tesserae of different thicknesses. Now I don't want to be too aggressive because sometimes accidents can happen or a tessera can be knocked loose when working with different thicknesses, although I can't imagine any of these getting knocked loose because E6000 is a very strong adhesive for this type of project. Thinset is cement-based just like traditional grout. But one of the reasons I like using thinset with glass-on-glass mosaics is because it's an adhesive. and it'll act as an additional adhesive, so to speak, in keeping everything together, everything in place, ride or die. Not that I don't think the grout would do a good job, but thinset is an adhesive, whereas grout is not. So not only am I grouting the surface of the tesserae, but I'm also grouting the areas above and below the line of mosaic artwork. I'm making sure that grout is getting everywhere, and I will come back and clean it off, but for now, I want grout everywhere. This looks good, and I'll put it to the side and start grouting the next one, which is the votive. Now this one is pretty straightforward to grout, and all of the tesserae are the same thickness, and the grout lines are basically the same as well. So I'll start by going in a clockwise, counterclockwise motion, just like we did on the previous mosaic. And I'm pushing the grout into the open areas between the stained glass. I'm also going along the rim of the substrate and filling in that area with thinset. And then I'll turn the substrate over and I'll do the same thing with the bottom. So once I'm done with grouting, I'll let the two of them sit here and dry for about 5 to 10 minutes before I come back and clean them off. Okay, these are looking good and they're ready to be cleaned off. Now I'm removing the thinset in the same way that I put it on by going in a clockwise, counterclockwise motion. And I'm being careful because, as we mentioned earlier, there are different tesserae thicknesses and I want to be mindful of that. Remember that when working with thinset, it's an adhesive and it dries faster than grout. So you don't want to grout too far ahead of yourself. But that's not the case with these projects because they're small, but it's just something for you to keep in mind for future projects. I'm also going to go along the top of the mosaic and the bottom of the mosaic to reinforce that clean grout line. You want to expose all sides of your tesserae, so you need to make sure that you clean off all of the extra thinset that may be covering the surface of your tesserae. Okay, this looks good, so let's move on to the votive. Now I'm doing the same exact thing here that I did with the vase by going in a clockwise, counterclockwise motion to remove the excess thinset. So this is a quick project to clean off because the tesserae are all at the same thickness and the grout line is considerably small. Again, make sure you expose all sides of your tesserae. Clean off that thinset or grout, whatever you're using, during this stage in the process because you don't want that stuff to dry on your tesserae. Next, I carefully remove the painter's tape from the bud vase. Now, let's say while you're doing this that you accidentally pulled out a little spot of thinset or grout. You would just go back in and repeat the grouting process in that little area, wait your 5 to 10 minutes, and then clean it off. And then what I like to do is run a chip brush or an old paintbrush over the tiled surface to remove any of the grout dust. And I did the same thing to the votive. And now I'll put those to the side and keep going with grouting the green vase. Again, I'm taping the area above and below the mosaic artwork to give me a straight grout line. I mixed up some gray thinset that's been sitting here for a few minutes and now it's ready to be used. So I'm grouting in the same exact way I did with the previous mosaics, in a clockwise, counterclockwise motion. What that does is it gets the grout, or in this case, the thinset, deep into the grout line in an even way, preferably down to the substrate. And I should also mention that the thinset I'm using is a fortified or polymer modified thinset, which means it's more resistant to being in, wet conditions, let's say, and these are vases. If you want to make a drinking glass or a wine glass or whatever you want to make, it's a good idea to use a fortified thinset because you're gonna have to wash that glass out and you wanna make sure that things stay in place. And now I'll let it sit here for a few minutes to dry before moving forward with cleaning off. Okay, the vase has been sitting here drying and now it's ready to be cleaned off. And I'm not doing anything different than the previous two mosaics. So I'm removing the thin set in the same exact way. I'm going in a clockwise, counterclockwise motion, making sure I remove the thin set from the surface area of each tesserae. Now, depending on what tesserae type you use, you may notice some clean off quicker or easier than others. And some act like they don't want to let go of the thin set or grout. Just keep at it and get those tiles clean. I'm also cleaning along the edges, which are above and below the tiled area. There were a couple areas that I felt needed a little more thin set, so I filled those in. But, now's the time to do that while you still have your grout or thin set mixed and it's ready to be used. After I let those areas sit and then I cleaned them off, I was ready to remove the painter's tape. And again, I went over the vase with a chip brush to remove any of the grout dust. Okay, now I know that this was a lot of information, but when it comes to glass-on-glass mosaic, I want you to know that you have options. So for instance, there are other adhesives we didn't use today which would also work beautifully. But also keep in mind, they have their drawbacks. And as far as today's projects go, I'm super happy with the results and love adding mosaic decor to my home. I'll include a list down below in the description for all of the tesserae, adhesives, and tools that I used in today's video in case you'd like to make a glass-on-glass mosaic of your own. Come on now. Okay, we have... Keep rolling. We're done, baby! We don't have time to waste on nonsense, do we? No! And you know what? We gotta put these on because Julie be blind. And away we go! I'm not blind, but they're helpful. Before the rain, before my son called, we are done! That was a long video. You just sat through it, and I thank you for that. Rot. Kya. Okay, fine. Maybe I squint a little bit sometimes. Whatever. Oh my gosh, that was so hard. What is my issue today? We got this. We got this. We love taking stuff like old jars, old wine bottles, old liquor bottles, and turning them into usable, functional pieces of art for our homes or office or whatever. So that's pretty exciting. I like it a lot. I'm so thankful you spent some time with me today. I appreciate you, I love you, and I will see you soon. Bye. For more mosaic inspiration, check out one of these two videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.